Greetings to you from the Episcopal Diocese of Utah. I am standing here today at the Cathedral Church of St. Mark, and as I'm standing here in this historic building, I reflect upon the pioneers who began the ministry here in our diocese. And most of all, I think of Daniel Sylvester Tuttle, the missionary bishop to our district at that time. Daniel Sylvester Tuttle encountered many challenges along the way. Distances between groups of people were far. There were no paved roads. He had to ride on horseback and by wagon. And he faced trials along the way as well, and challenges. The things that he faced, we do not necessarily face today. We have the roads, we have vehicles to take us to and fro, and even if necessary, we can even fly to a location. And because the world has changed since Daniel Sylvester Tuttle's time, you and I face different challenges, and that is simply, what does it mean to be a church? How do we run this thing that we call church and congregation? And like it or not, we have city codes, county codes, laws which must be enforced in the life of our work together. We also have church canons. We have church health insurance, church pension, background checks, a myriad of details that Daniel Sylvester Tuttle, frankly, did not have to worry about. And because we have these things in our lives today, the better that we can attend to them, the better off we are, because it frees us to do the important work that we share with Daniel Sylvester Tuttle, and that is how best to spread the gospel. So I offer to you these modules to help you and all of us be as effective as possible in taking care of some of the temporal matters of the church, in order that you and I can be about the important work of spreading the gospel.
We might all work and serve at a church, but at our workplaces, it is the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, OSHA, the IRS, the state, the feds, the city, and the church canons. Oh, and the church. As a congregational leader, you need to know a few things when you hire someone. First, use common sense.
It's not about memorizing checklists or long requirement lists. It's about just recognizing that this process of interviewing and of reviewing information is about discerning who among the candidates best fits the qualifications that will serve the congregation, and that you treat everyone in that process with kindness, dignity, and respect.
The diocese requires background checks. They are not only proper for our ministries and our people, you as a church leader could open up the church to liabilities.
Background checks are critical because there's a standard of care for employers when they're recruiting and hiring people not to hire and just deploy people who pose a risk either to the assets or the property of the church, but in our case, even more importantly, that they do not pose a risk to vulnerable populations, including children and the elderly. And therefore, if a background check would have disclosed that a person had a criminal background or a background involving abuse of those relationships, harm actually in past employment situations to children or other vulnerable populations, and we haven't checked that out, and we've gone ahead and hired them, then we would be exposed to liability for negligent hiring and supervision, and we would be exposed to civil claims of sometimes very large dollars.
Yes, we are surprised to find this policy is not universally followed.
Sometimes we don't find out about a congregation's having hired someone until we read it in their newsletter 6 or 8 months later.
And background checks do work, and they do catch potential problems before they can happen.
In our review of background checks, we have consulted with the hiring official from the congregation and effectively disqualified from employment or placement probably between 5 and 10%, maybe closer to 5% of applicants. There is, however, by the fact that we do background check, a certain element of self-selection. And sometimes people who have troublesome backgrounds when they know they have to go through a background check, simply won't apply. We have no way of knowing how many people that involves. But we have either disqualified from service in the church people, or we have limited their involvement so that they can't, for instance, drive a vehicle on behalf of the church, or they can't be in any way involved with handling money.
Of course, call the diocese before or during any hiring process. We are here to help. Now we come to the letters of agreement, especially when we're dealing with clerical hires.
Letters of agreement are very important, and they need to be very carefully crafted, and they are to be reviewed by the bishop and by the chancellor. But they must at least conform to the all the oaths that apply to the office, the canons, and to a certain degree to state law and federal law.
There are some misconceptions about working for a church.
The church does enjoy a certain latitude under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution for its recruitment and employment and supervision of clergy employees or people involved in ministry activities. But other employees are not really involved in employment tasks that fit within the definition of ministry. And therefore, they are protected by employment laws, discrimination laws, sexual harassment rules, and so forth. And the same kind of rules apply to them that would apply if they were working for a secular operation.
And there are misconceptions about vendors, such as those you hire to clean your glass.
When vendors come on the property who may be at risk, that is both an issue with OSHA regulations and with workers' compensation kinds of liability. And therefore we require vendors who come on the property to do work to demonstrate that they have workers' compensation insurance protection. Otherwise, we become their insurance carrier, and we're not in the business to be an insurance carrier.
Vendors and contractors, they need to be bonded, insured, and qualified. Now, unfortunately, sometimes there is a need for termination. While the employee's tenure is ending, the legality is just beginning.
We can help walk through that process with them. It's critical that you recognize that in Utah, lay employees are employees at will, which means that they can be terminated any time with or without cause. The importance of that is that it's not necessary to vilify them or to build some kind of case against them just because they're not working out. And it's much better for the employee, but also for the reputation of the church, to make such separations clean and efficient without damaging the reputation of the employee.
And be careful of what you say.
In terms of protecting the personal rights of the people involved, confidentiality is important. Everyone is entitled to a certain zone of privacy, and the relationship between themselves and their employer sometimes fits within that zone of privacy. The congregation is entitled to know that the employment has been terminated and that the termination is going to happen on a certain date. They're not necessarily entitled to know all of the nitty-gritty details of what didn't work in the relationship that caused that termination to happen.
Be careful not to offer specifics to the congregation. Again, privacy.
Unless, of course, there is termination for cause, some wrongdoing that might even be the equivalent of a crime. That would be different. That would certainly reflect in the overall interest of the congregation. But most terminations happen because the expectations of performance or the relationship has just not worked out, and it's not really of sufficient gravity to involve the whole congregation.
Okay, now we have people working. What about the church building where they work? As church leaders, you are responsible for much of the building.
The rector or vicar, under our canons, has control over the uses of the church and especially of all worship and ministry activities. The vestry or bishop's committee has responsibility for the physical plant, for the building and grounds. And by typically in the letter of agreement with the priest, works with the priest in supporting the priest's work with the congregation.
Now, church building use is all about profits. Seeking a profit in this part of the church is perfectly fine, as long as it's a biblical profit. Seeking a profit, P-R-O-F-I-T, is not fine in this part of the building. Churches are nonprofit, and so are the groups that use them.
The use of church property for a for-profit commercial venture is a very clear violation of the exempt restrictions on the use of the property. So if we have someone who wants to use on an ongoing basis or even a standalone basis church property for what is really a proprietary commercial operation, has nothing really to do with the purposes and ministry and mission of the church, or even on a wider sense of charitable and educational value to the community. It is really a business that is precluded, and we would very strongly counsel the congregational leadership to stay away from that.
Oh, be careful. Some groups sound like they're nonprofit. Nope, can't even let Weight Watchers in.
Typically, they're problem users when they involve businesses. They involve for-profit entities, commercial activities. Even Weight Watchers, while it has a certain health benefit, is a for-profit business. And we do not operate for-profit businesses out of our buildings. That clearly violates both the income tax exemption, but especially the property tax exemption requirements.
It would be terrible to lose tax-exempt status.
Tax-exempt status is one thing when you're talking about having to pay taxes on revenue. The other that is actually even more critical would be the loss of property tax exemption. Most of our congregations would simply have to close if they had to pay property taxes on the value of those churches.
Now, this doesn't mean you cannot charge for church use or church-owned spaces. It just isn't a profit center for you or a group. And how much to charge? Remember, it isn't just the cleanup. It's the lights, the carpet wear, the parking lot, the wear and tear. It all figures in.
They should determine what their actual cost is for operating and maintaining their property so that they have a legitimate basis upon which to establish a fee or a contribution, suggested contribution, that approximate what it actually costs them to make that space available.
If you don't charge those fees, you are making a cash contribution to that group. Now let's say you charge the Old Time TV Collectors Club, of which I'm president, to use your parish hall for a meeting, but you did not figure in cleanup, lighting, carpeting, that kind of stuff. Well, it'd be like your church gave a donation to the Old Time TV Collectors Club, and your church wouldn't want to do that. And even if it is for your own church use, be careful. Let's see. Do not sell tickets. Have suggested donations. Don't have a raffle in Utah. It's illegal. At least tell folks they don't have to pay for a ticket. Then it isn't a raffle. And alcohol. Learn the diocesan policy. Have an attractive and available alternative to liquor, and be sensitive to those wishing not to drink. And speaking of policy, it is policy to take racism and church worker training. Above all, above the buildings, it is the protection of the people.
Our policy defines who the people are by the service and ministry they are providing that may require them to take those trainings. In some cases, that's also provided for in the canons of the church. But people in governing roles are required to take the anti-racism training. People who serve in various defined roles where they work with vulnerable populations, supervised or unsupervised, are listed, and whether or not they are also required to take the Safe Church training, or what we've called church worker training. And that training is about preventing misconduct. It is about educating the individual on how to protect themselves from situations where they might be vulnerable to allegations of misconduct simply because they allowed themselves to be in one-on-one situations with people that would be in violation of those policies and that training. So the training is really valuable on a number of levels, and most everyone who has taken the training, both kinds of trainings, have found that it has contributed substantially to their ability to do mission work.
You are not just taking a job or a volunteer position, you are part of a ministry with canonical obligations.
There is a canon in the general canons of the Episcopal Church that requires that any person who accepts an office in the church will fulfill all of the duties of that office with fidelity and loyalty and due care, and essentially acting to the best of their ability. So if you become aware of a condition or an activity or even misconduct that threatens the best interests of the church or the interests of the congregation, and you do nothing about it, you would have violated that duty.
And is there a liability to that?
There is probably not a liability in most cases in terms of civil liability or financial liability. There is a liability in terms of the continuation in office, and under some circumstances the person would be removed or could be removed. There can be legal exposure to liability if the misconduct is something that is an ongoing threat of harm to individuals, and where the governing body has a responsibility of oversight and direction over the wrongdoer and fails to act.
So if you have a question, pick up the phone and call the diocese.
First piece of advice is don't expect that you will ever know all of that. Second piece of advice is that you take reasonable steps to acquaint yourself with the canons and the rules and the policies. But perhaps the most important advice is when something happens or a question comes up that is of concern, that you pick up the phone or you send an email or you ask. That there are people here all the time at the diocesan level who will help you find the answer to that or help you respond to the kind of question that will allow you to serve with confidence and comfort in the ministry of your governing role. We don't expect priests to know all of this. We hope they will also call when they have a question. And we certainly don't expect lay people who serve on governing bodies to be experts about all these rules and regulations. We're here to help. We're here to help with answers or to help find new solutions when there's some new troubling event.
Yes, you have a lot more legal stuff to think about today, and we give you far more canons and laws to worry about, although we also give you running water and electricity and casual Fridays. Bishop Tuttle never had that.